Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shruthi. I'm part of WiREnet. So today we have gathered together to have a conversation on housing. So just before we start, I would like to mention that we will be recording this session, and hope all of you are okay with it. And in case there are questions, you could ask that, you can reach out to the faculty and they can guide you. And in between, we'll have some question and answer session. Yeah. Okay, with that, we'll start without any delay. Thank you for being there on time. WiREnet is an organization, non-profit organization founded in 2018. And with that, we have actually conducted multiple events. And this is one of our venture wherein we'll be connecting with students and sharing our knowledge with the help of our industry experts. So I would like to invite Shobha to.
Thank you, Shripriya.
Thank you.
We can move to the next slide, please. So very quickly, this is WiREnet, and we've been associated with Manipal School of Architecture and Planning for this year, 2025-26. We're a non-profit association. We were founded in 2018, and we were registered formally in 2021 with the aim of empowering women professionals in real estate, design, construction, and built environment sectors. You can see on the board, we are 7 founder members, and we've registered this as a non-profit society or association. And the primary reason is to promote gender diversity and inclusion within the industry, which, as you all know, right now holds the record for being one of the poorest diversity and, diverse and very poorest in terms of diversity and inclusion. Yeah. So if we can move to the next slide. This program, which we call WiREx, is an initiative where we plan to reach out to students at large and engage with you all, hoping to bridge the gap that exists between academics and the industry. How do we do this? We bring experts from our own member base, and we bring them to you to share their knowledge, their experience, their expertise with you, thereby allowing you this opportunity to interact and learn a lot more about what goes on in the industry. We do this through lectures, workshops, sometimes site visits, and we make mentorship available. We've run this very successfully in Bangalore with Bangalore Institute of Technology in 2024-25, where we've recently also started a students club in collaboration, and we are continuing that association this year, 25-26, with Manipal School of Architecture and Planning with you all at MAHE, and hope to take this further. Our first session, if you see a picture on the right extreme, with all of you all was in April this year, where we spoke about the business of consulting. And we have planned a series of another monthly sessions, which are webinars. We could be doing more in person as well as the program unfolds. More formats will also unfold. If you can go to the next slide. I want to take one moment to, bring to you all the people who are behind this. It's a very, very large team. Of course, our patrons from Manipal. I would like to thank Dr. Kalyan Mukherjee and Dr. Pradeep Kini. Both of them, we've had a chat with them in the first conversation similar time last year. So it's almost like 12 months before that we had this conversation and said we should do something together. So under their patronage, we've rolled out this program, and Dr. Vidya has been very, very helpful all throughout in coordinating these sessions. For this particular session, we have Professor Amit, who logged in exactly at 3 p.m. today and has been waiting since then, and Professor Monika. Thank you to both of you. And we also have our volunteers. That's me, Shobha Raghunathan. I'm one of the founders at BuildEd. Shri Priya, who spoke just now, she also is from the real estate department at Shell. And Nandita, who is our community manager, who has been like the backbone of this entire program. So with that, I would like to introduce to you our two speakers today. We have Shruthi Padmanabhan. She is, of course, member of WiREnet. She is also a landscape architect with and a director at Sthala. She has experience at Foster Partners and Townsend Landscape Architects from London, and she brings extensive expertise and experience in designing sustainable landscapes and public spaces that shape housing environments into inclusive and resilient communities. That's Shruthi for you. And we have Keval Kaushik, who is also partner at Sthala and a director for urban design. He has a master's in housing and urbanism from AA at London. His work in India and in the UK focuses on housing-led regeneration, estate renewal, mixed-use developments, exploring how design and can actually create more equitable, livable housing solutions. So both of them are the experts who are going to speak to you. And Shruthi and Keval, please, feel free to elaborate more on your experience and your expertise when you start your presentation. Thank you so much. And with that, over to you, Shruthi.
Thank you, Shobha. Hi, everyone. We're really grateful to have you all listen to us today. So just in terms of starting off, I just wanted to start with one of my, let's say, favorite books, which is The Poetics of Space. And there's a very, very nice introduction where it talks about how our house really is the corner of our world. It's the place that we're born into. It's the place which is we consider our first universe, which is really the real cosmos in every sense of the word. But how did a house evolve? How did it become what it is now? And what was really the story behind how a house, which was just merely for shelter, become something so fundamental towards our existence and our space in the current climate is something that I'm going to explore with you today. So to start off with, we start from the very, very beginning and about when the hunter-gatherers in the world used to have, the ability to build houses, right? So these were predominantly temporary shelters built with as readily available material as possible, such as rammed earth or wood or even thatched material, hay, whatever they could get their hands on. And it was really that thin layer that separated them between the inside and the outside world, which was purely just a structure which was built for collective survival. Like I said, the materials were very common. They were easy to source, and the fundamental sort of theme was collective survival. So how can we separate ourselves from the outside world, from the weather, from the animals, from anything that's harmful to us, and just provide a space which is warm, easy to accommodate for the family, and easy to inhabit in whatever climate they were, because obviously the hunter-gatherers kept moving as they went on, so they didn't really have the idea of permanence, and it was just about how can we create the simplest structure in the quickest way possible to house our family, which will give us the warmth. So a simple structure such as this would have the female side on one side, the male on the other. You would have the ceremonial hearth, which is where, let's say, the central heat of the house is generated. And then you would have small corners, where the woman would be seated or the man would be seated, but it was all the idea of collective survival. and everything used to happen in one space. The same space was used for warming the space. The same space was used for making food, for drying grain. Occasionally, livestock were also, kept in the same location. If there were cows or chickens, anything, all of them were housed within the same shelter. There wasn't really a gender, class, or even species differentiation. And it was literally the entire space holding a family together. The concept of privacy was not something that was even a thought for people back then. And it was every single sort of emotion felt in terms of what is the sort of the decoration of the wall in terms of the paintings that they've experienced on an everyday basis was all put on the walls, something that they wanted to elaborate and share with everyone. So the sense of privacy was never something that anyone felt as part of the home at that point. We forward ourselves 1 century on, and you look at a common house where then you see that people start differentiating spaces, that suddenly there is an idea of maybe, we can have maybe multiple partitions within the same wall in order to create differentiation in how people are using it. Mind you, this was not a way of people trying to create specialized rooms. Like, it was not identifying that the side room will be the bedroom and that's where everyone will sleep. That was not the objective. The objective was just to create partitions within the same space in order to allow different activities to take place in different areas. So for example, in this house, a woman would be bathing the child, whereas the cattle would be at a corner. And in this house, maybe the cattle is in the middle. So there was never a primary function which was given to the walls or the separations that were created, but it was more segregating, the idea of segregating the spaces that evolved. As we move forward, especially in dwellings in Mali or even in early civilization that you see in Riyadh, you start seeing that this slowly evolved into specialized rooms. There was an idea of having a living space where maybe the people would gather, sit, eat their meal, talk to each other, talk about the day. There would be an idea of a granary where people would then store their food, store a granary. And also the idea of a bedroom where there is a specialized function of only sleeping. So there was suddenly the main factor of privacy, which became fundamental in how the housing developed. And as the agricultural reform came into picture, the hunter-gatherers slowly started accepting one space as their own. That is what led to having the idea of, if I have this one space, I would like to have multiple specialized spaces within that in order to aid a certain function. And this is how that housing, if you zoom out in a city level, back then, how would that sort of materialize? So this is the old town of Adiriya, where you can see that the streets were sort of just a point to take from A to B, but the houses had the central courtyard, and then each functions faced towards the courtyard as well. And cities, spanning geographies have had this sort of structure, this sort of model. And then as you move forward to sort of the next century, you can sort of see that the idea of permanence seems to settle more in how people are building their houses. The use of rock, the use of having closed spaces, the use of suddenly introducing fenestrations or windows, different kinds of windows into the space to cut out the natural light, starts becoming a theme. Suddenly the furniture starts to be something that they start introducing into their houses as well. And then the privacy and the cultural norms form a way in which the house would slowly develop one by one. And as you move forward, you notice that although the house becomes the private space where they inhabit, suddenly the public spaces become a place for people to gather as well. So the Roman baths, for example, very well known for women to gather around, have a central space where the bathing would happen. The same with the Turkish baths, or the same with the step wells in India. And these sort of the changing in evolution also led to how the external amenity spaces that each of these civilizations perceived also grew. So you can suddenly see that the amenity spaces became secondary spaces from home, where people would move out, and then the city would become an important part of the development as well. Another really sort of important milestone towards housing development was the introduction of corridors. As colonization came into picture, and as the idea of classism sort of came into a lot of European culture as well, the idea was that the servants or the slaves were not required to transverse through each and every room. So the objective was that they could move only within the corridors, and the main inhabitants of the house or the aristocrats were then present with their own sort of specialized rooms. So they would just go in and out as needed. And that's when corridors completely changed the way that people could live. How can we then go multiple sort of levels using staircases, and how can corridors aid a kind of living where there was a segregation caused by class, and the societal constructs and human relationships that were built in that era were fundamental in the development of the housing at that point. And as we hit the early Renaissance era, people started personalizing their space. It was no longer just about the walls of the house, but it was the grandeur of the house. It was about the culture that they came from and the culture that they are staying in. So it's suddenly about how can we create spaces which are more personalized. How can we get artifacts from our hometown, to how can we bring artifacts from where we are staying into our homes and create that sense of grandeur or extravagance using these houses. And that's how each spaces then started getting their own charm and character. The living spaces were decorated in a different way to the dining spaces. The more public spaces were decorated with slightly more grandeur to, let's say, show off, whereas the more personalized spaces were done so in a different manner. Probably charted the first, evolution of how interior design came into picture in the housing as well. As we move forward, we then go into the Industrial Revolution, where the idea of man going to factories or going away from their home as part of their work became an important factor in how housing was formed. When men used to go to the industries, they were completely covered in dust, and they had to come back home, wash themselves. Therefore, the evolution of the bathroom, another private space which the man could wash off the dirt away from the children, away from the rest of the family, so that they are not polluted at the same time as the rest of the family. And sanitation became one of the main reforms as part of the Industrial Revolution, and that led to the importance of specialized rooms and their uses. It was also the first time that gender started playing an influence in housing design. It was required for the man to go out of the home to the city, whereas the women was seen as someone who was taking care of the house, taking care of the home. So that the personalization of the house then became more on the woman and more on how the woman likes to utilize the space, and therefore the proximity of the dining spaces to the kitchen, for example. And then we talk about how, as the Industrial Revolution happened, there was the crunch in the cities, and how can they try and get multiple stories within the same space, so that let's say the density can be increased. So you can see a classic scenario, whereas an earlier, let's say, a barn house was then later converted to an upper story house, or maybe of just one floor. The entrance was made more grander, and then suddenly, the houses grew one more story. So that sort of led to the evolution of how city planning has been influenced by housing design as well, and especially something that you noticed in European cities. That also was an important aspect of the staircase being, how people move from each floor, one floor to another, and how that led to how the privacy was then. Each floor had a certain level of privacy as they moved above. And then, obviously, one of the most important factors was the elevators. Sorry, elevators were usually used only in warehouses where they, took very heavy load down all the way up for goods and materials. But the utilization of those elevators in the housing context enabled the housing to go more vertical. And that's predominantly seen in the US, where you can see New York, Chicago, those kind of places where the elevator gave them the ability to go vertical and wider. So therefore, more houses could be accommodated within a smaller space. More blocks could be accommodated in a smaller space. A lot of manual elevators also existed back then. This is one of the oldest ones in Chicago, which then gave people the opportunity to spread across different floors as they go on. And that, along with what I mentioned earlier about the gender and societal roles that were that each gender was conformed to, led to how cities were planned. So you can see this is a suburban sort of city in Australia, and you can see how the central part of the city was where the school, the factories, the business centers, town halls, everything was located, and the houses were located more at the periphery. So the women were confined to these areas, and then they sort of leave their children to the school, for example, or the men go to the work. So you can see how then housing design has fundamentally played in how the citywide planning or citywide scale has been developed in different areas. Cut to sort of the 1900s and the post-industrial revolution, you can look at modern homes where the idea of let's say the introduction of automation was the key factor in how homes were developed. Suddenly, there was no longer a requirement for coal to be burnt. Therefore, there was no need for the kitchen to be segregated from the rest of the house. You could have an open plan kitchen, and therefore the kitchen could be right next to your working area, because the machines used to do majority of the work, from the cleaning the vessels to cleaning your clothes. And open plan became something that was romanticized with the idea of automation and the industrial sort of revolution. And moving to today, we've sort of come, let's say, a full circle along with technology, where you now have smart homes, where everything in your home can be controlled with one device. And from your Wi-Fi to your something that's making your roti, everything is controlled with one device. And each sort of spaces, each sort of amenities that we saw earlier on, which was split out with, either bathing areas or gymnasiums, etc. in Rome, suddenly now they are part of within the same house. That is defined as, let's say, luxurious living, where your gym is in the same house, you're working in the same house. So the housing, in the sense, has come, I would say, in a very interesting cycle, when we are currently looking at trends where everyone wants everything within the same space, within the same house. And that's really, in a very oversimplified diagram, the evolution of housing, of how we came from a single room dwelling where the sort of the hearth or the fire was the central space, to something like smart homes, where having home offices and gyms are sort of considered your luxury at the moment. So I can stop for a second now, if you'd like, just to take any questions, and then I can hand it over to Keval.
Sridevi, are there any questions? Sorry, Shripriya.
I don't see any questions in the chat, but from the audience side, do we have any questions? If there are any, please raise your hand. If not, in the interest of time, we can move forward. Is there a question? Looks like nothing. So, Keval and Shruthi,
I was
getting back
wondering
to
if
you.
before that, would you want um, to just have Professor Amit say a few words, and then that'll give some time for the students to sort of come up with their questions if they have any.
Yeah, sure.
Uh, Hello, am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, yes.
Okay. First of all, thank you for hosting this event, and it would be really value addition to our seventh semester housing studio. And this insights, looking at a different aspect of housing, will add value to their the way they are working on their projects. Right now, though, they are working on high-rise structures, kind of a thing. But this was a good, you can say, initiation about the whole history of housing covered in such a short duration. Maybe the students will have a questions after the at the end of the program. But thank you for half the program we are done. So another presentation, and after that we can take the questions. Is it fine?
Yeah, sure, sir.
Okay, okay.
I'll just hand it over to Keval now. Yeah.
Thank you. Over
Hi.
to you, Keval.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon. So, what we go through now is the different typologies of houses and housing that we've gone over a period of time, and where we start from different types, starting from units, single units, to going all the way to multi-story units, and the evolution of that. And how we look at that is from the perspective of different zones. If you look at one of these units as a single zone accommodating area within a house of a certain proportion, we then develop that further into how each of these zones add up to create a larger unit, or a larger multi-storied building. So I'll touch upon each of these elements going ahead. What we also would like to elaborate is from the earlier part that we've heard of regarding the evolution of housing, from a stage of sort of temporariness or temporary shelters. We've moved on to a time where all of these units are permanent. So each one of the housing and what we develop now, we're looking at that as a gap between, we're looking at culture as a gap between the humans and the nature, and a culture as a gap between that. And we look at our housing, whatever type of housing that is there, sort of ties up these two together. So in the case of permanence, you start adapting to a certain context, a certain could be an area, a region, a place, a city, or moving into a state or a countrywide. So when you decide to permanently locate at a particular area, you're talking about absorbing that culture, and that's what you start trying to reflect. Now, as we keep moving, as you see a lot of people moving for work and for different aspects of at different stages of life, you also see them taking culture that they've grown up with into their houses. So whether it's decoration, whether it's types of spaces that are there within the house, that speaks of themselves and speaks about what they've experienced over a period of time. And as we talk about these different types of units coming into play, we speak about also how different cultures and different aspects come into play, and how a certain type or a certain typology of building starts tying up all of these different aspects together. For example, how does a person staying in a cold climate in the north come down to, say, the southern part? How do they adapt to those conditions? A is climatically, B is also there's a cultural shift to a certain extent, and how do they adapt to that, or how do they introduce what they've grown up with within their houses? So we start seeing a lot of that evolve in individual houses as well as in multi-story units, and the types of spaces that we see evolving in all the houses. So to begin with, we probably start with detached houses. So these are individual houses that we see all around the world, in India as well specifically. What we see here is the living room and the dining and the kitchen towards one extent, and then you have the other bedrooms and the other private spaces towards the other extent. What you can see is these facades, or what you can see along this image. The facade is quite transparent to allow that interaction with the outside. So when we're looking at when you look at spaces like living rooms and dining rooms and kitchens, they might want that sort of external interaction. But the minute it comes into other spaces, which is the bedrooms and the bathrooms, or could be other private study rooms, they might would want that to sort of have more permanent built walls around that area. So you can see the difference between this facade and this facade. So that's where we start seeing, or we start categorizing how each of these types get differentiated from space to orientation and the amount of exposure that they have to the external side in terms of facade treatment. And as we combine multiple zones together, in this case, we look at this as a single zone, and then we move on to semi-detached housing. You start combining two of these zones together, and you start creating a small, you create a sense of interaction. You encourage people to interact between these two units. So you start having common spaces, as you can see within these areas, within back gardens or within those back zones, that you start having common amenity spaces, and a sense of interaction is developed within those areas. Similarly, as we move forward, you start seeing combination of multiple units or multiple zones being put together. Here, what we're seeing is clustered housing, row houses, which are combined. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are several factors, which is a space, second orientation, and the third thing would be the facade treatment. So orientation is for the amount of light pouring into the units in itself, and the space would be, say, for example, a few people would like their dining space to be a private space, not with a lot of interaction outside. So then you start looking at areas where they're oriented in a way, or the amount of light that's pouring into those zones can be designed or can be structured around in that manner. Similarly, could be with kitchens, could be with living rooms. So this again starts depending on the certain kind of culture that you've grown up with, or what you want to show or project as part of your living. And that's where there is open kitchens that come into play, which creates a certain sense of space and also a sense of culture within that area. So for example, here when we're looking at it, a unit that's vertical in dimension, say we're 6 meters by about 10 meters or 12 meters in width, that's oriented towards two directions. So you have larger part of the openings there. So what you see is that certain uses are structured towards the area where there's a larger opening, and then certain areas which require privacy are oriented towards the area where there's less amount of light pouring in, or there isn't an interaction with another unit. So it might be so this might be facing towards the street where there is interaction with multiple people within an area or within a development, whereas the other one might be facing towards the back garden. Similarly, if it's oriented in the other sense where there's a longer facade opening with a larger opening towards that side. So say, for example, 6 meters is towards these sides and 12 meters towards the other facade, then you have a different sort of orientation. So what you see here is privacy being tucked in here, but you have majority of your units face towards majority areas or spaces which are open to that sort of interaction that you want with the outer side. So that's a decision that you would make with housing whenever you're designing row houses or individual units as well. A combination of this on a larger scale, there are concepts around mat buildings, which is multiple houses laid out together. Now it raises several questions in terms of the privacy that is set up on this, so the amount of light pouring in here or the amount of light that's pouring in here. So when you're working with your housing dimensions, it starts coming into play. What is the minimum dimension or the maximum dimension that you work with between two facades? So if there are opposing units, say if I've got one unit here, another unit here, what are the dimensions that you work along with? That sort of avoids looking into each other's unit, or you would want it the other way where you want interaction. So if it's a living room facing a living room, then you might sort of narrow that space down so that lets that interaction between two neighbors. But then if you want that to be a private space, then you might sort of increase the space that you might have between those units. So you might have about 18 meters or anywhere between 14 to 20 meters if you want to increase that space to avoid overlooking into each of these units. So all of this starts playing an important role, and these numbers almost need to start being back of your head when you're working out any housing project in terms of which is the extent where I can overlook into the house, which unit, where the bedroom's located to avoid privacy, to get that privacy or avoid overlooking. So all of these points start coming into play when you work on slightly larger units. Similarly, when we start going vertical, as we mentioned, the elevator and staircase has been major shift in terms of innovation that has helped us go vertical. But apart from that, what we start seeing is these units, as we start going vertical, you have more density achieved. More density creates a sense of more interaction. Not even a sense, a feeling is well, more interaction within a group, within a community. So you might have like-minded people staying in an entire apartment, and everyone's accepting that culture when you're staying in an apartment. So when you're staying in a vertical building, you are accepting that all of you are going to get the same view. You are accepting that all of you are going to interact at some point in time, and that housing is meant for you when you're staying in a skyscraper building. So then there are questions around how do you create those spaces where they interact. In this case, it's a simple corridor which is narrow where everyone's houses come onto. But then as you split over vertically, whether you create intermediary spaces or not, as your balcony, a continuous running balcony or a facade, become the point of interaction that you might have with others. Similarly, we go into the development of these into linear blocks, which could be called the slab. So you can see here the larger cutouts that could be the space of interaction, balconies that act as interaction, not just, so this you start creating an interaction with the street. There's a sense of surveillance, there's a sense of security that it brings through, but also creates an interaction with the outside world. And then as you see, there are cutouts here that help with larger spaces within the entire slab for interaction. Similarly, you also have openings at intermediate levels that can create those communal spaces that you might have. So in an individual house or in a housing development, as I showed earlier, you would have common amenity spaces where people would pour into to have that sense of interaction. But how do you incorporate that when we're going vertical with us creating the density and catering to, in a sense, urbanization, also catering to the influx of the crowd that's coming into each of these cities. So all of these start playing a major role. Now here, the last image I'd probably also like to bring into focus the size of the openings. Now as we go vertical, there's also the question or the thought that you need to give into what's the size of the opening that I give in there, how much of light I want coming into each of these units. And how important of a role it does play. And you can almost start reading the entire orientation of the house from the facade and elevation. I see each of these units, each of these smaller openings, those almost seem to me as openings towards the bathrooms, ventilation units. Then you start having larger units here, which could be the living room and the dining room. And these are stacked up units, so that could be a bedroom with a balcony on top. So this is the example of Kanchenjunga that we've seen in Mumbai, where you have two-floor duplexes throughout the entire building. So the elevation starts giving you a sense of what the arrangement is within the entire tall building itself. So I'll just reiterate this, where we talk about size, orientation, surface area, exposure in terms of the facade, and how all of these start playing an important aspect in whichever housing you do, whether it's a courtyard block, whether it's a point block or a slab, or even an individual semi-detached or detached houses. I just discussed this point earlier, but I think what this starts showing you is when you interact, when you work with certain facades, the amount of light pouring in, you almost start looking at those spaces with lesser amount of light, fixed with certain activities and fixed with a sense of privacy within those zones. So it starts working along those lines with whatever housing units you might work. I'll go through a quick combination of the type of blocks and how each of these come into play. Now, these are single space dwellings where all of the orientation of these are all single oriented towards one side. So what you can almost see is within back of each of these units, you start seeing a corridor running past there, and that starts developing the entire unit into a vertical space itself. But these are single spaces oriented towards one side. Similarly, when you start adding deeper units, you start getting dimensions. I'm just probably taking a proportion here. You might have 6 by 12 meters in size, where the larger unit, the larger dimensions on the back side get lesser amount of light, whereas these start getting larger amount of light. So you start designing based on that. Similarly, as you start going deeper, every site or context gives you a different complexity to work with. So in this case, when you're developing the layouts, you might end up in working with something that has deeper plots. So you have deeper dimensions. So one side might be about, I would say roughly about 15 meters, but this extent might be about 40 meters. So what you're seeing is the deeper unit. So how do you start getting light into those in between units? So then you start having scoop outs or cutouts within those spaces. As you can see here in this apartment, you start having those cutouts that helps you with, again, the 3 points. I come back to the 3 points. One is the exposure to the surface area exposure, the orientation, the type of space there, and the area and the use that you're catering to. I'll probably put in perspective the same discussion with this point. So you've got rooms here, which has that external interaction within that zone, and then you've got a kitchen located within this zone, and you have a bathroom located here within that darker zone that might probably require privacy within the entire unit. So that's how you see that space worked out, and then these work out as these could work out. Sorry, these are bedrooms, and these could work out as dining and kitchen areas, which are exposed to a larger amount of light coming in. So it helps you planning individual units and also how you go vertically onto higher floors. Similar different arrangements with the slab. Now the slab creates a particular, when you design a linear block or a slab as what we've seen here, you're clearly saying that the unit's going to be oriented towards two of these sides, and you are creating a hard stop there. So if you have a street running here with a slab, you're almost, with this typology, you're almost saying that people cannot view onto the other backside of what is happening behind that. And then the interaction is going to be between units that are which are serialized like this to create a density, to create interaction between each of these blocks and units, and if you want a certain kind of orientation within your entire development. So what you will see in these blocks, as you start combining from one zone, you start developing into 4 or 6 zones, there's almost a sort of necessity to start creating a courtyard, to start creating a larger open space amidst what you've got on the plot, to have that amount of light pouring into the units. Now within those, that can be single oriented or double oriented. So these dimensions start working as well. If you're looking at one set of units on that side, one set of units on this side, understand what's the dimension at play. 18 meters, 20 meters, 16 meters with a corridor in between. So your corridor is going to be dark and dingy within that area, and then you've got these units on one side and those units on the other side. So all of this comes into play when you're going vertical on a skyscraper or on anything that you're working, any type of multi-storied housing that you're working with. Similarly, other examples of showing these cutouts in between to help with light pouring into those units. In this case, you can see that there's a corridor running all around the entire open space. So all of these units, as soon as I look at this image, I know the rest of the units are all single oriented, and that's what you start seeing in these drawings as well. That you see an orientation towards that side, and that almost becomes the corridor where you wouldn't have much light and orientation, much of light coming into those areas. So there's not always one particular way of working these blocks and typologies. So this is just to show you a sort of an entire stretch where forms come into play, and where you combine different types of blocks, different types of blocks into creating a particular built environment. So you've got a point block here with a podium. You've got a serial block here, 2 point blocks. Now that's and a podium in between. So all of these result in a certain kind of development and a certain kind of not just aesthetic, but a use that you're developing within the entire site. If you're looking at a courtyard block, you are pushing the residents to use that communal space for interaction when you're suggesting a courtyard block. Or similarly, when you're suggesting 2 point blocks on a podium, you are telling people that you will interact on that podium level itself. Or in this case, you're telling them you will interact on that rooftop space. So whatever you design, whichever blocks you put together, you are dictating how a person would live in that block, in that building, and in that neighborhood. And it also works the other way around, where that person, whoever's moving into that space, is accepting that culture, is accepting that as a space of living that you're going to live with. So this is a diagram that we developed for one of the projects where we start looking at a combination of all these aspects coming together. With the current trends and with the shifts that we spoke about, you start having a lot of amenity spaces clubbed into larger blocks, I would say. So you start having gyms, you start having clubhouses, all of the non-residential commercial activities coming into the lower spaces, and then you have larger spaces, gathering spaces in between that speak about a certain event, speak about spaces for certain events or certain sizes of gatherings. So you might have this space that works for a gathering of, say, about 200 to 300 people, but you might have this space here, which is slightly more smaller and intimate, which is about 50 people. So that space of interaction is between these two blocks, whereas this works for all the blocks coming together. Similarly, you might have these blocks and their space of interaction happening on the rooftop. So it's to show that a lot of these spaces can come together, or a lot of the blocks can come together for you to create types of buildings can come together to create a block that you would want and what sort of environment you would want to create. Similarly, now we need to start thinking of how this starts scaling up, because the minute you draw it out, sorry to point out, but I think you need to expand your focus apart from the red line boundary that you always see any architect working with or anyone working along with. So you need to almost start looking at it from a wider perspective, because you start interacting with buildings and with the surrounding area. So for example, this is one of the master plans that we've developed as a practice, but what we're showing you here is different approaches and different sort of environments that we're creating with each of the options that we're working with, where this creates a larger courtyard and communal space in between, and each of these units have their own individual communal spaces with houses and row houses here and individual houses here, semi-detached and detached here. Whereas here we start creating smaller communal spaces and interaction between smaller blocks, I would say, and smaller communal spaces. So each of these layouts and master plans translate into different environments that you're creating and different types of spaces that you would want people to accept externally. So this starts combining with your houses. So what we try to elaborate on is the humans, the natures that I spoke about, and now with these spaces and the types of spaces, we're developing a certain type of culture within each of these layouts. So to show you that it doesn't stay within plan itself, you need to develop that vertically to create a sense of density. So the minute you look at these vertical units, you know where lifts are coming into play, where staircases are coming into play. So you start getting a sense of a lot of that, and you know that these blocks are denser. So also you start providing larger communal spaces to cater to that number of units that you might have within that area. So you might be catering to, say, about 50 units per hectare for spaces that we might have houses, individual houses. But the minute we go into slightly larger units, you're catering to about 100 units per hectare as the total number of capacity or density that you're developing. Similarly, different other examples of how different houses, units, and communal spaces start coming into play. You can see here apartment blocks, individual houses to create row houses with back gardens and larger communal spaces. You would have schools coming in between, or clubhouses. So how all of that can come and fold together, because what you're doing with this community, with the housing, you're creating sort of environment where people can access their school within 10 minutes of walking. They can access communal space within that area. Now, when you're starting to work on a skyscraper, there might be a single use, or if it's multi-use, it's mixed use. How do people access those spaces? What is open to public? What is private? So there are a lot of questions that you would need to answer when you're working on housing at any point of time. Another layout that just shows you a combination of different units. These are L-shaped blocks. Now, these units, which are perimeter blocks broken down, that creates strong facades or strong streets along all sides. So you would have a perimeter block placed along those areas because there's an interaction that happens with the street. But the minute you break it down into these kind of sort of more permeable blocks, what you're actually telling people is, I want them to walk through these spaces to interact this larger green space that we have. So you walk through these units or walk through that space to help them access those spaces, and also you're creating longer views for these blocks that we have. So we probably, I'll just sum it up with this, that dwellings in a sense are the structures that form the backbone, not just of your individual place of living, but also the backbone for a neighborhood, for a city. And you need to assess that through culture and through how those spaces are used, and make your propositions or your designs based on that. Thank you.
We'll just hand it to Shripriya now. If you could take any questions or closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Keval and Shruthi. Very well articulated, and a bit of history and how the amenities and everything was around the space, and then in a very storytelling way, and then more details on how the spaces can be, accommodated. Not just accommodated, but we also have to think beyond the red boundary, as Keval mentioned, very well articulated. Thank you so much. Now, we will ask our students, our lovely audience, do you have any questions? If so, we're not able to see you very well, but then you can just come to the front and ask questions.
Yes, we have a few questions. I hope it is audible.
Yes, yes, very
well. Hello, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
we can hear you. Yeah.
My name is Ishan. Ma'am, as you told before, that how corridors were used for like servants and stuff. Like before, I didn't know why corridors was like a dead space. Now I understood what the history of it. And first, sir, my question was like how can these ideas be used in the Indian context, like for our housing or for our clusters? How can these be used?
Could refer to the pics.
Sorry,
view as well. He's just asking about how corridors, how can that be used in the new housing? I guess, like how can we make them better? So if I understood the question correctly.
So so if I understand your question correctly, you're talking about, there are 2 points that you mentioned. One is how do we use these corridors if you're using within your proposition, and the other thing is how do you go about that? Yeah. So is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So a couple of ways of looking at it. So how we mentioned historically that the corridors were used for people within, could be slaves, could be servants, could be different things. So if you look at the British houses, if you visit any of the old colonial houses, you'll always see a corridor running around their entire house. Now that initially was used for any help that is there, for them to serve each of the rooms from there. All the rooms open onto these corridors. Now over a period of time, that has been adapted, and that now corridor is being used as an outdoor seating area. So people use that as study. They use that as a temporary space. So in the Indian context, you have the veranda, so that long corridors that you do have start becoming spaces of interaction, similar to a veranda. So that's how you start adapting and looking at it in terms of how you want to utilize each of these corridor spaces. You will have corridor spaces, whether you want to locate them. If you're going, say, taller, or you're looking at a larger multi-storied unit, you will have. So one question is whether you make these corridors, convert them into spaces that are acceptable. The other thing is also around, so you could put in an activity into those spaces. You could have, if the corridor is on the outer facade, then you could extend on to creating larger balconies there, which become smaller points of interaction. So you'll have, as I broke it up earlier, at even in a master plan or in a block, you will have larger communal spaces. Then you have sort of semi-private communal spaces, which is a courtyard within a larger multi-story building. But that's to gather a certain number. Now, if you want to incorporate that gathering at higher levels, then start creating those types of spaces, right? So if you have, say, a corridor running on the 10th floor, so then you create smaller seating spaces or pockets of spaces or add activities there. Instead of clubbing the entire, instead of going with the perspective that clubhouse happens on the 20th floor where everyone come, break it down. Break down your clubhouse onto every floor. That helps you create that sort of interaction. That's an extension of the corridor and lets you work out the building in a different manner.
There are some nice examples of this as well. I think it's called, if I'm not wrong, the Mountain View building, which is a housing development in Copenhagen, done by Barke Ingels Group. Really well, I feel, articulated projects in how the corridor also can, become a space. I think it faces towards the parking or something like that, but then it activates the corridor in a different way. There's a similar one by Remkulas in New York, where again the corridor is it becomes a space of viewpoint. You see sort of different things happening of interest. So wonderful examples out there how some of these groundbreaking architects have done some really nice, interesting work with the corridor.
The point that you raised about how to digress this, the simplest way of doing it is take any plan that you find interesting, done by any architect around in the world. Just take that plan and plonk it onto your site. The minute you do that, you start understanding the complexities of the site, and you start understanding how to work from that. So any plan you might find interesting, put that onto the site that you're working with, onto the layout, and take that as a starting point and evolve your design from that. In terms of whatever spaces you want to create back and forth, and then take that as a process in terms of how you want to digress and how you want to propose. Because the largest point, and I put this across quite straight away, whatever you do is not unique. It's already been implemented and done everywhere around in the world. So take examples, plonk it onto your site, and start working from there to create the type of spaces that you want to create.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Shan. Any more questions? And in the meantime, I also want to mention that we've just put together a QR code to give your valuable feedback. So it might take a minute or two for you to fill in that using your smartphones.
It was a really good presentation. And yes, ma'am. It was a really good presentation. Any more questions? Okay. Can we kind of summarize this whole thing?
Right. Okay. Thank you so much, Shruthi and Keval, for presenting to our lovely audience here. And I also would like to thank Dr. Vidya Rao, Assistant Professor, Professor Amit, Professor Monika Jadhav, Dr. Kalyan Kumar Mukherjee, Dr. Pradeep Ji Kini, and to our WiREnet volunteers and our members who are present to the call. Thank you so much.